I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is Yuri Zhukov, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the causes, dynamics, and outcomes of conflict at the international and local levels, based on the many empirical cases in the region, including those of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and the North Caucasus. And he has published very widely on these topics in top academic journals. He participated, I guess it's maybe a month ago now, on a roundtable that we organized on the crisis in Ukraine before the beginning of the war, in which he discussed several scenarios of what might happen given the military movements that we were seeing on the border of Ukraine with Russia and Belarus. Unfortunately, I think the worst scenarios came true. So Yuri, welcome. Thank you for being here. And we continue to have like the rules of putting questions in the chat or raising your hand. And Professor Zhukov will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A. Professor Zhukov, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Geneviève, fellow panelists and respected audience. So it was actually a month ago today that we had the panel that Geneviève mentioned, where I laid out a range of military scenarios for how this might unfold. And I'll be honest, I've been freaking out about this since November, perhaps even since April of last year when the buildup really began. And just by looking at the movement of forces on the map, you could tell that what was happening went well beyond more routine military movements, because over the course of the past 8 years, Russia has significantly expanded its presence on the Ukrainian border. It has stood up 2 new armies, and there's a lot more movement of forces associated with that near the Ukrainian border that we need to take into account. But what we've been seeing over the last few months went a tier above that. And a lot of what we were trying to discern at the time was what Russia's political objectives were in this entire crisis. And what they teach you in any command and staff college, any professional military education institution that focuses on campaign planning, is any analysis of military operations has to start with the desired end state. The end state is the political objective that is articulated by the national command authorities, which is another term for political leadership, in this case, Putin. And the end state, as far as we can tell from public statements made by this political leadership in Moscow, is that they want a demilitarized and denazified Ukraine, which translated into English means at a minimum regime change. But I would go further than that, because I think simple regime change alone will not be sufficient to meet the political objectives of the Kremlin. Because ultimately what they want is a pro-Russian government that is willing to accept Russia's annexation of Crimea, the independence of the Donbass, neutral status for Ukraine, and a range of other concessions that have yet to be articulated. These objectives are incompatible with Ukraine's existence as a democracy and with Ukraine's existence as an independent sovereign state. Achieving these objectives will require long-term occupation, potentially annexation of the entire country. And because the fundamental problem here is that it's what we in international relations and political science call commitment problems. Russia's leadership does not see Ukraine's political leadership as currently configured as being capable of making and honoring commitments, particularly those that they make at the point of a gun. This was the main takeaway that they learned from the Minsk process. And the issue here is that Ukraine is a democracy. It's a country where the incumbent has a non-trivial chance of losing office, both through elections and through extra-constitutional means, such as the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And as far as Russia is concerned, because of that reason, any commitment that is politically unpopular that Ukraine's leadership signs on to, even if it goes so far as to enshrining neutral status in Ukraine's constitution can be undone by the next administration. So simply overthrowing Zelensky is not alone, it's not going to solve Russia's fundamental problem here. I think the kinds of political objectives that they set out for themselves go well beyond simple regime change as we typically know it. And I also think it goes well beyond the capabilities that Russia has in theater on the military side. So I'm going to share some slides here because I want to show the current state of affairs in the war as it can be discerned from the data that we've been collecting. So I'm going to try to do that right here. And so right now you should be seeing a slide that says Russia's invasion of Ukraine, military strategies and scenarios. So what I'm about to show you here is going to be built off a new resource that I've stood up over the last few days. It's a near real-time event tracking system for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's available through my GitHub page at this address here. We can all go there on your browser right now and download these data and begin looking at them. These data are based on news reports from media sources, both in Ukraine and in Russia. In Russia, this includes both independent outlets and state-controlled media. All the events have been geocoded with precision ranging from being geocoded to the level of the oblast down to or province down to the level of the street. It's highly variable. They have temporal precision down to the minute, and each event in that database is accompanied by full source information, text, and URLs. So this is even if you do not consider yourself to be a data analyst, you can simply go in there and begin reading what sources both in Ukraine and in Russia have been writing about this. I've been updating this resource daily, sometimes twice daily, and I'm going to continue doing that. It's an automated system that scrapes down this information every 6 hours, runs it through a machine learning algorithm, and then produces what you see there on your screen. Now, the kind of sources that I'm drawing on here include both Ukrainian and Russian outlets. These include both television news networks, wire services, websites, as well as newspapers. There are some sources here that are unambiguously Ukrainian or Russian. There are some that occupy a strange middle ground, like Interfax Ukraina, which is the Ukrainian affiliate of Interfax News Service in Russia, which has some editorial autonomy. And then there are some sources like Media Zona in Russia, which is, I believe, now blocked, which is an independent outlet that in their coverage actually much more closely resembles the median Ukrainian news outlet than the median Russian one. And I'm putting all this source information out here for a reason, and that is what we know about this war, we learn about this war very much depends on which media sources we're following. And as great as the New York Times and Reuters and Western media have been at this, the volume of coverage that happens in the region, particularly within Ukraine itself, is an order of magnitude beyond the volume of coverage that the West can afford to do, because war is everything over in Ukraine right now. That is the #1 topic, obviously, for clear reasons. So what is the current situation? So what you see here is a map of territorial control at the level of individual populated places. And as of this morning, when I last updated this, about 21.7% of Ukrainian populated places, that's everything from village up to cities, are under Russian occupation. This includes Crimea. This includes the Donbass. Now, this advance that the Russians have been pursuing has gone in 4 or 5 main axes of advance. The one that you've probably been hearing the most about has been coming down from the north in Belarus toward Kyiv. Over there, the units that have taken the lead on it are mainly airborne forces, the 76th Air Assault Division, some elements of the 41st and 36th Combined Arms Army, other elements from the Eastern Military District that moved into Belarus over the course of February. There are also some elements of Rosgvardia, or Russia's version of the National Guard, including some Chechen units over there. And Rosgvardia units are mainly one would think that they're mainly intended as an occupying force, more so than to conduct full spectrum maneuver warfare, which they're not really trained to do. Another axis of advance has been from the northeast over here, around Chernihiv and Sumy. That's been led by the 20th Combined Arms Army, and there's kind of a double envelopment of Kyiv that's advancing both from the north and from the northeast. Around the Kharkiv over here are elements of the First Guards Tank Army. They've been quite slowly working to envelop Kharkiv, but also the main objective in that part of the country seems to be to cut off Ukrainian elements in the north of Donetsk Oblast off from potential reinforcements in Kharkiv, which is why a lot of the focus has been around the city of Izium over here on this main road going down to Donetsk. And then in the Donbass, elements of the 20th and 8th Combined Arms Armies have been taking the lead over here, along with local separatist forces. And up from Crimea is the final axis of advance, which has had the most progress so far, and that's mainly elements of the 58th Combined Arms Army, some airborne units from Crimea as well. So right now they occupy about 21.7% of the country. This is actually, if you look just a few days ago, or much earlier in the conflict, if you look at the map from the 27th of February, when I started collecting these data on territorial control, the exact same statistic here: 21.7% under Russian occupation then, 21.7% under Russian occupation now. What's changed since then is some fairly effective Ukrainian counteroffensives up here in the north around Kyiv, as well as some of the areas in Mykolaiv Oblast in the south that were previously contested. Ukrainians managed to push some of the Russian forces back. The Russians are, however, making steady progress in Luhansk Oblast. Almost all of it is now under Russian control. As well as over here in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, working to close this envelopment of Mariupol. So what's going on? Why has the Russian advance stalled? So there's been a lot written on this in the press and in commentary and think tanks, and I would urge anyone who's interested in the military operations side of this to really follow the writings of my old friend Michael Kaufman at Center for Naval Analyses. He's one of the brightest minds looking at this right now, and he does this for a living. And I generally agree with many of his assessments, which is that Russia started out with a deeply flawed concept of operations that relied on basically a knockout punch to Kyiv in the opening hours and days of the war, followed by the rapid capitulation of the Kyiv government. They expected this, by all accounts, the same kind of welcome to their forces as they received in Crimea in 2014, where they were greeted as liberators. There was a pro-Russian population there, more mixed in the Donbass, but also part of the reason why the advance has stalled is because they're not fighting the way that they were trained to fight. So the main organizational concept in the Russian army, the main primary combat unit that's capable of independent operations is called the Battalion Tactical Group. So this is a combined arms task force with about 800 personnel on average. These are typically formed from motorized infantry or armor units, sometimes from naval infantry or airborne forces. They also contain some support elements such as artillery, logistics, anti-air defense. Sometimes there's some tactical aviation that's providing combat air support. And this is how they were trained to fight. Basically, motorized infantry working in close coordination with armor, with air support, with artillery units softening up the battle space in front of them. That is not how they've been fighting. In order to capture Kyiv quickly, they've broken up these battalion tactical groups into smaller units. So individual companies racing toward the main objective, operating without support, outrunning their logistics. And so this is a way to gain ground very quickly if you expect very little resistance. But it's also a very easy way to outrun your support and also to create these long traffic jams behind you as these units, the field kitchens, the logistics, artillery units in the rear move in behind you, and they're having a much slower go at it. They're much more vulnerable to ambushes by Ukrainian forces, and the units out in front are eventually cut off from their supplies. They're cut off from fuel, and there are many cases of reports I've seen of Russian troops foraging for food and supplies, sometimes abandoning their kits that seem to be in fully working condition. Now, so that's how it's been so far. If we look at the distribution of violence, now the distribution of territorial control, we see a much a much broader swath of the country being under attack. So these are all event reports in the data set as of this morning. Not all of them are about violence and military operations. Quite a few of them are about humanitarian issues, human interest stories. There are quite a few reports there about Western sanctions and Russian responses to them. So if we look at just the events that are classified by this machine learning algorithm as being military operations, you see there are about 7,000 operations like that, individual ones that are reported all across the country. Most of these attacks, particularly in the West, are airstrikes and missile strikes against military installations. Typically, the first step in any military operation of this kind is you take out the enemy's command and control systems, you take out their anti-air defenses, you take out their air force, trying to get it when it's on the ground to gain control of the skies. Actually, the Russians have not been terribly effective at wiping out Ukrainian anti-air defenses. They've been holding back. Some of the speculation is that they're saving some of their more precision-guided systems for a potential war with NATO. If it were to escalate that, there's a limited stockpile of those systems that they have. But this also shows you that there is not a single Ukrainian oblast or province that has not been affected by this war in some way. There has not been a single region of the country that has not experienced violence. And if we look at potential changes in Russian tactics, what we've been hearing a lot about is how Russia has been increasing more and more on relying more on standoff systems like missiles, artillery rocket systems, airstrikes, as this initial concept of racing toward Kyiv with a very limited resistance has clearly fallen apart. And what we do see is fewer reports about ground operations. This is the unfiltered data, so sometimes there are reports in multiple outlets about the same event that had to be deduplicated. So at this point, all I can show you here is before I've done that additional filtering work. This is just the proportion of reports that are about ground operations, firefights, armored offensives, stuff involving troops on foot or on trucks or on armored personnel carriers or on tanks. There's been a general decline from the first couple of days when those thunder runs ground to a halt. But the increase in airstrikes and shelling, as far as we can tell from these data, has actually not been as extreme as what's been reported in the press. In part because what's being reported in the press are airstrikes and shelling against much more visible targets. These are civilian areas, parts of Mariupol, Kharkiv, major Ukrainian cities, and those kinds of strikes against residential areas and commercial areas and the centers of towns are much more visible to observers. They're much more visible to journalists than strikes against military targets that are sometimes hidden from public view in the first place. So there's been this shift over to more civilian targets in built-up areas. And as one would expect, we've also seen many more reports about civilian casualties resulting from military operations. There's been a steady increase over the course of the past few weeks, and we should probably expect that trend to continue. Now, What I'd also like to point out here is that this is not simply a war, of course, on the ground. Another thing that they teach you at the war colleges is that there's more than one instrument of national power. Military operations are just one of them. There's also the diplomatic instrument of power, the informational instrument of power, the economic instrument of power. You know, we used to call this DIME, diplomatic, informational, economic, and military. Russia has been going full speed ahead on the military dimension. The US and its allies in Ukraine have been going full speed on the information front and the diplomatic and economic front with the sanctions. But I just want to show you how differently the picture looks in this information space. If you look at the violence from Russian sources versus from Ukrainian sources. So it is not the case that Russian media, including after the crackdowns on Echo Moskvy, Dozhd, and the other more independently minded outlets in Russia have occurred, it's not as if Russian media is hiding information about civilian casualties. In fact, they're reporting quite a lot about civilian casualties. And sometimes a much greater proportion of Russian news stories are about civilian casualties. Reported by Ukrainian sources. What we in fact see here is that a lot more of the Russian sources are reporting violence that's happening in the Donbass against Russian-speaking civilians in the Donbass that Russian forces are there to protect. And of course, we were told that there's a genocide happening against the Russian population, which is why you see this disproportionate, at times, emphasis on civilian casualties by Ukrainian forces. So in addition to where the violence is happening, there's a different picture in terms of who's perpetrating the violence. So here are here's the percent of reported violent events broken down by actor. The red dots here are the percent of violent events that are about actions by Russian forces. Basically, Russian forces shelling, Ukrainian cities. The blue dots here are reported actions by Ukrainian forces, presumably also shelling Ukrainian cities, but also on the offensive and counteroffensive and the defensive against Russian forces. And what we see here is a pretty clear pattern. Ukrainian sources report disproportionately actions by Russian troops, and we see a near mirror image in the Russian media sources. Now, there are some nuances here. The Russian newspapers that I'm talking about have a slightly different emphasis. Probably the most distorted picture here is in Russian television news. If that's how you get most of your information, you're going to be hearing a lot about Ukrainian troops shelling civilian areas. And if we break this down by individual source, what we see is we can rank them by what proportion of reported events are by Russian troops versus Ukrainian troops. And there's pretty much a clear pattern from Ukrainian to Russian sources to the point where RIA Novosti, Russia's main news agency, about 50% of their reports are about actions by Ukrainian forces shelling civilian areas in the Donbass. On the opposite end of the stream are sources like Ukrainska Pravda. Probably one of the more balanced sources is Militarny, which is like a military blog, kind of like a Ukrainian equivalent of War on the Rocks. They also used to have a pretty good podcast, which is not currently being updated for obvious reasons. But and then there are some sources in the middle, like Media Zona is kind of on the edge, and Interfax Ukraine, Russian-owned Ukrainian news service, actually resembles the median Russian source much more in its coverage than the median Ukrainian source, compared to an agency like Union, for instance. So just to wrap up, if you're following the war through Russian media, first of all, it's not a war. It's a special military operation, as has already been mentioned. There's much more focus on the fighting in the Donbass, much more focus on actions by Ukrainian forces against civilian targets. You see quite a few reports of Ukrainian deserters and POWs, including ones that are being interviewed by Russian journalists, in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions. There are very few reports of Russian losses, deserters, or POWs. And war is seen through Ukrainian media as almost a mirror image of this. Of course, there's a full-scale war countrywide. You get a much more comprehensive view of the picture. Relatively little focus on fighting in the Donbass. Part of that is because Ukrainian media has been reporting on fighting in the Donbass for the past 8 years. That is not new. But also now Russia has opened up 4 new fronts across the country. There's only so many journalists to spread around, and so they have to make choices. There's also been more focus on actions by Russian forces against civilian targets, Russian deserters, POWs, and we know relatively little about Ukrainian losses, deserters, and POWs, in part because also the Russians are not reporting those very much as well. And so neither of these gives you the full view. I would say that the Ukrainian media give you a much more comprehensive view of the picture. But as a social scientist, I have to say we have to include propaganda outlets in this as well. Just because they very selectively report on certain types of events doesn't mean that there's nothing we can learn from them. We can learn quite a bit, including what the Russian public knows about this conflict and what the basis is for their current levels of support for this war. So I think I'll stop there, and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Yuri. This is most helpful and also terrifying to see, but perhaps also encouraging to see that actually the Ukrainians are able so far to kind of keep Russians in certain, push back, but how long they'll be able to do so, that's the question, especially since we have reports of no electricity, no gas, no food, etc. So I want to bring a question back from Oksana Chabanyuk, who asked a previous question about airstrikes and the request of Ukrainians to NATO allies, well, not allies, but to NATO to actually ask for a no-fly zone. She herself was in Kharkiv until a few days ago. So this is a question that's actually very close to home. And what you're thinking is likely to happen. I mean, you showed in one of your slides that there is actually an increase of these types of, interventions in Ukraine as people on the front are having a harder time. So what's the situation with airstrikes? And
yeah, so one of the reasons why I consider the last 2 weeks to be by far the scariest in my professional life is all the ways that this could escalate into a third world war involving the use of nuclear weapons. One of those ways is to the establishment of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And this is a policy after that enjoys widespread support among the American public. I've seen opinion surveys that say that 75% of Americans support this. Certainly, I would imagine that most Ukrainians would support this as well. But what this means operationally is establishing a no-fly zone begins with an attack against Russian anti-air defense systems, which are located inside the territory of Russia. There's no way to establish a no-fly zone without attacking installations on Russian territory. That automatically means a direct war between NATO and Russia. There are other ways that it can escalate as well. There's been a lot of talk about transferring fighter jets to Ukraine, about potential Ukrainian pilots flying sorties from airfields in Poland and in other NATO countries. That the Russians have been quite clear they would consider to be a red line. They would consider that to be direct involvement of NATO in the fighting. And that would almost certainly spark some kind of interdiction effort by the Russians. We should also expect Russian interdiction efforts of other types of supplies that go on by ground over the Polish border. Mm-hmm. So obviously the Russians do not control that border yet. Hopefully they will not for a while. But when they are in a position to interdict those supplies, that will certainly be another potential way that this could really get out of hand. So as you know, as appealing as the idea of a no-fly zone might sound, that is not an option that is being seriously considered by anyone in Washington at this point. There are most forms of support that the Ukrainians are likely to receive from here on out are going to be either of the same variety that we've already been seeing, or they will be on the covert side, special operations, CIA missions, and the like. I mean, the U.S. has. Think about what the U.S. did in Afghanistan during the 80s and the kinds of supplies that they gave to the Mujahideen. The U.S. has some experience in this, but obviously, an outcome in which this crisis escalates into another world war is one that all sides would have an interest in avoiding, and tragically, this is a case of nuclear blackmail, essentially, that Russia is committing here. There's no way to push back on this that would make Russia cease its military operations right now. There simply is not. There are options that would turn Russia into North Korea, and those options have been actively pursued now on the sanctions realm, and they're being quite effective. And pretty soon they will have that intended effect. But in terms of what we can actively do to put a stop to active combat operations in Ukraine, not a whole lot, unfortunately. The best we can hope for is to bog Russia down into a quagmire and to make it scale back its ambitions in the Baltics and in other parts of Europe.
Yes. Okay, I've got two questions, and I'm having a problem with my screen right now. So I see two raised hands, one by Will. Will, I see you, but we're going to give the opportunity to others. But before I do, I have a couple questions I will read to you. One is by Alexander McConnell. Can you comment on the issue of conscripts versus professional soldiers and what effect this might have on Russian military operations, or on how the domestic population might potentially respond if participation of conscripts increases? And I've read also, about the Wagner units and people, some of them fighting for Russia, but also you have Ukrainians from the US, from Poland going back to fight in Russia. So that's one question. Another one is, why isn't Russia deploying electronic warfare systems on a larger scale? And then I see one raised hand. So maybe you answer these, and then we go to the gentleman with the raised hand. I don't see your name on the screen, unfortunately. So Yuri, you're...
Sure. So on conscripts, so this was surprising to me, in fact. For a while, Russia was denying that it had sent conscripts to Ukraine. Denied it until earlier this week, when General Konashenkov admitted that there were cases, erroneous cases, according to them, of conscripts being sent to Ukraine. I mean, we know there are conscripts there because of Ukrainian footage of interviews with these conscripts that apparently did not know that they were in theater for anything other than exercises, and they did not think that they would be sent into harm's way because they were conscripts. And this is obviously a sensitive issue in Russia because this is one of the main differences between the First and Chechen Wars. In the First Chechen Wars, conscripts were sent down there, and it was a nightmare from a PR standpoint, of beyond the carnage, of course, that this unleashed. But in the second Chechen War, Russia overwhelmingly relied on long service professionals. It relied on long service professionals also in Syria, in the first invasion of Donbass in 2014. And right now, there are reports that they're pulling in additional reserves right now from all over Russia. The way the reserves work in the Russian army, they're trying to go over to a more U.S. style reserve system, but for the most part, these are people who were formerly conscripts. They went through the basic training, then they, they're retired into the reserve so they can be called up in some future contingency. So there's people who were just conscripts not long ago. So as this war escalates, we're going to see more and more people being sent to the front on the Russian side who are not long service professionals. This will be very difficult to manage from a public opinion standpoint. So we should expect the Ministry of Defense to try to conceal this as much as possible. Yeah, they're already doing that. They claim that this is a one-off incident. On the, I guess we'll have to wait and see. On the volunteers, both. So there are volunteers coming in now, apparently from both sides. There are volunteers coming in on the Ukrainian side, which several European countries have said it's okay for our citizens to go fight there. You will not be prosecuted for participating in a foreign war, which is typically a crime. Now Russia, I think earlier today, claimed that there are tens of thousands of fighters from the Middle East. They're just waiting to get into the fight on Russia's side, and now Putin has authorized them to do so with impunity. So this is going to escalate. This has echoes of the Spanish Civil War. Of course, this is not a civil war, and the Spanish Civil War itself was a very internationalized effort in that sense, that has all countries from the region becoming involved in some way. So I think this, if it continues on this track, this war is going to take on fairly monumental proportions. On why Russia hasn't used EW more, I don't know. One hypothesis is that they're saving a lot of those kinds of assets, and a lot of their. I mean, we also haven't seen them use a lot of their unmanned aerial vehicles. We have not seen a whole lot of tactical aviation until the last few days. They're holding a lot of their capabilities in reserve. There's also tactical nuclear weapons that are in their arsenal that could be used in theater, potentially emitting an electromagnetic pulse, which would have huge damage. And part of it is, I think this is just Russians holding a lot of their capabilities in reserve in expectation of escalation of this conflict to direct confrontation with NATO. They don't want to put all their cards on the table in the first round, right? And so they're very much thinking about worst case scenarios and how this might unravel and how this might escalate.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Zhukov, for sharing your expertise on this. I invite you to stay on and participate in the conclusion at, I think it's going to be at 12:40 or so. Thank you.